Thank you very much for having me, Greg. What I want to do to start is give you just a really brief history of the ways that terrorists have used the internet historically. I think there is a false perception that this is a new problem, and it isn't. The very first sort of hallmark terrorist use of the internet was in 1984. It was a man named Louis Beam, who is probably a name. Anybody have heard of Louis Beam? Louis Beam's an American white nationalist. He's still alive. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And in 1984, he started something called White Aryan Nations Liberty Net, which was basically a digital posting board where you could put up messages, other people could look at them. And that really was the first time we saw a terrorist use a digital platform to distribute their message online. But what's interesting about this is that terrorist use of the internet was invented in America, but it was productized here in London. And so if you fast forward to the mid-1990s, there was a man that lived here. Now he's somewhere in Syria, maybe alive, maybe dead, named Abu Musab al-Suri. That may be a name that you've come across in the past. Abu Musab al-Suri had a vision that was very similar to Louis Beam's. Louis Beam wrote an essay called Leaderless Resistance, because he thought that organizations needed to be deprecated, that the different white nationalist organizations in the United States were always infighting with one another. They were getting in each other's way, and the organizations represented something that law enforcement could target. So he wanted people to be able to act on their own based on information that was available to everybody. Abu Musab al-Suri, in the jihadi context, had a very similar idea. He thought, and his great line is, instead of bringing people to the training camps in Afghanistan, which is what happened in the 1990s, we have to bring the training camps to the people. And the way he thought you would do that is through the internet. But how do you actually do this? In the 1990s, the real challenge for these guys was they had simple websites. Al-Qaeda started its first website in 1998. They used Western corporate infrastructure at the time. A lot of those early websites were hosted on GeoCities, for those of you that remember GeoCities. But where this really became productized was with a man here in London named Yunus Suli. He was from a Moroccan family. He liked to call himself Irhabi 007, or Terrorist 007, Terrorist James Bond. And what he did in 2004 was he created a basic framework for the distribution of propaganda, of videos that were being developed in Iraq by a man named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, killed in 2006, the godfather of what we today call the Islamic State. And what happened in 2004 was the terrorists recognized that broadband gave them the ability to distribute larger files. But they had a problem, because they would try to get these larger video files up online, and their supporters from all over the world would come to that one site, try to download that video, simultaneously that file, and the site would crash. The broadband wasn't that good. And so what Yunus Suli did, what Zarqawi started to do, is he would send the video to Yunus Suli here in London, and Suli would do something that the jihadis still do today. He would upload that video to numerous file sharing sites across the internet. And then once that was done, they would have a pre-planned release where they would release those URLs, that list of URLs, on some primary distribution site. And at the time, it was a jihadi web forums, which were dedicated web forums controlled by administrators that were supportive of Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and other jihadi movements. And then what would happen is that the supporters would go, they would choose from one of potentially hundreds of links, they would download the file, they would re-upload that file to other places, and then they would post those links again. And so you saw this sort of viral effect of getting this kind of content across the internet. The difference today is not so stark. That basic model still exists. You still see ISIS go through a very similar kind of process. They still have formal media entities that create propaganda. They still, before they release them, they upload them to file sharing sites across the internet. They also upload them to video streaming sites, because that's the technology of the day. They still have primary release points, but today it's not web forums like it was in 2004, 2005, 2006. Today it's usually Telegram. And you still have secondary processes where supporters of these movements take those files, re-upload them elsewhere, and then share those links. Now, when you think about Facebook, we fall into that secondary distribution model. We don't see ISIS try to upload stuff to Facebook before they distribute it on Telegram. It's not how it's working. What winds up happening is that these supporters, once this information is released, they try to put it up on Facebook. They try to build an audience there. That gives us an opportunity, because none of this behavior is allowed on Facebook. There is no place for terrorism on Facebook. You can't be a terrorist on Facebook. It is against our policy. I don't care if you are uploading pictures of kittens or your puppy, you can't be on Facebook. The trick is, how do you find that stuff? How do you find these kind of secondary distribution of this content? Well, really what it requires is both automation, smart automation, and smart people working in tandem. We use a variety of automations, and I'll tell you about one, but that distribution model gives us an opportunity. Image and video matching is very useful. So we identify known terrorist propaganda. When it is uploaded to the site, we can surface it. We can either kill it upon upload, or when necessary, we can put it in front of a human being to take a look at. One of the ways we try to get ahead of this problem is that the primary distribution point is still Telegram. We are at a secondary stage. So it's both the matching of the images and the video that comes out of these organizations, but it's also how fast can we process that stuff even before it gets to Facebook. When it is released by these organizations originally, can we capture it, triage it, process it, make a decision about what we want to do with it, so that as soon as it actually hits our site, we know what to do. And we're going through that process all the time. We use a variety of other automated techniques. We're using machine learning on text of posts that we have disabled in the past for supporting terrorism, to find similar kinds of posts in the future. Clusters of those kinds of posts you might see on a page or in a group that might indicate something. One of the great problems is when we find this kind of stuff, we disable the accounts, we'll disable the content, and people try to come back. They try to come back by recreating fake accounts or new accounts. We're getting a lot better at identifying the patterns and the way that they do that. We call these people recidivists, which isn't really quite the right word, but it's sort of a term of art internally. We're getting a lot better at finding those folks, but the techniques that they use to try to get around our detection literally change on a week-to-week basis. Right? I can't tell you today exactly what we're doing because our team is probably adapting it as we speak. So we're using all of these kinds of automations, but at the end of the day, sometimes automation isn't actually good enough. We don't actually trust the machine to make the right decision in some of these cases. And so we have a team, there are 150 people internally at Facebook, whose primary job is dealing with counterterrorism. Some of them are academics, like my background is as an academic. Some of them have backgrounds in law enforcement and government. Some of them work on our operations teams. Some of them are engineers. Within that team specifically, we speak 30 languages. Within our operations team overall, we speak about 80 languages. It's really key, because one of the hard things about dealing with terrorism is that terrorism is fundamentally a political endeavor. It's an ideological endeavor. We don't want to suppress contentious political speech. We don't want to suppress, in fact, we want to encourage it. We don't want to suppress religious speech. But sometimes the signals that a computer is going to pick up has a hard time distinguishing between those kinds of speech. And so we need to put those kinds of posts, that kind of content in front of human beings to take a look. And it needs to be in front of human beings that speak the language and understand the cultural context in which that is being shared. And so this is another way that we actually use machine learning, is when we identify this content, it's not necessarily the immediate action that we're going to take on it, but let's make sure that we get that piece of content in front of the person that can make the right decision. We're making progress on this. We are far from perfect, but we are making real progress. it is increasingly difficult for ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these kinds of figures to host their content on our platform. I'm not going to look you in the eye and say that you couldn't find it, but it'll be a hell of a lot harder today than it would have been 2 years ago. In the future, we're going to have to do more. Because one of the greater challenges when we step back from me as somebody that works at Facebook, when we think about this as a social problem, we don't just want to displace this kind of behavior to a different platform. So how do we help build resilience across the industry, across the internet, to this kind of dangerous content? We've got a couple of initiatives to try to do that. The first is, and you may have seen some of this in the press, is the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. This is something that we announced with Google, Twitter, and Microsoft, and we're working with a range of smaller companies. One of the interesting things about this is that the large companies have gotten together to talk about these issues for a long time. We just didn't talk publicly about the fact that we were talking privately. And now we've built this entity, this global forum, what we internally call GIFCT, with the idea that the larger companies that have been at this for a while, we've made some mistakes, we've learned a lot of lessons, and we want to share those lessons with some of the emerging players in industry, so they don't have to go through that same sort of learning process. GIFCT really has three pillars. The first one is information sharing. The second one is technological cooperation. The core of that is a shared database of hashes. A hash is, probably don't need to explain that to this crowd, but a hash is a digital fingerprint of a file. And so we are sharing hashes of known egregious terrorist content with one another. That's happening today. We announced that first with YouTube, Twitter, and Microsoft. We've since added a range of other partners. More are going to come on board. Now, one of the interesting things there is, even though we're sharing those hashes with each other, this is a way to tip one another to this kind of content. But there isn't an agreement that we are all going to take the same action on that content, which I think is an important dynamic here, right? Different companies, different platforms imagine themselves and their relationship to their users differently. At Facebook, we have a very stark position on this. Not everybody else is going to take that same position, and that's okay. We don't want to tell them what to do. But we do want to make sure that they have the information that is necessary, that they can use the fact that we are building these very robust systems to find this kind of content. We can help others so they don't have to build replica systems, especially the companies that don't have the capability to build those same kinds of systems. So that's GIFCT, that's hash sharing. The last one is we want to do shared research. Greg mentioned Charlie Winter here in London. Part of the challenge here, when we think about terrorism for internet platforms, is when you think about terrorism in a traditional context, governments and people, I used to teach at West Point. It's very easy to come up with a universal definition of terrorism. Then you start poking, well, do you consider some of the Syrian revolutionaries terrorists? Do you consider some of the Rohingya militant groups terrorists? People have a harder time answering some of those questions, even though the tactics that are used by these kinds of different groups are very similar. It's really, really difficult. And I think what's interesting here is that for the global platforms, we actually have a much broader interest in identifying terrorism globally than any particular government does, right? We see protests here in London in favor of Hezbollah, in favor of the PKK. Those are both groups that material support or support for those groups in the United States can get you thrown in jail. So there's even differences between how the US and the UK think about these issues. We have to think broadly because our community, Oliver doesn't like that term, the Facebook community is 2 billion people around the globe. Our interest is in making sure that they are as safe as possible. And that's not just ISIS and Al-Qaeda, it's small groups that are all over the place. It is groups like National Action here in the UK, which we consider a terrorist organization. It's groups in Northeast India, small Maoist organizations that don't pose a threat outside of Northeast India, but do pose a threat to some of our users there. Those are people that we care about. Those are not people that every government in the world cares about. But we have an obligation, we think, to do what we can to keep those people safe. Now, what's really, I think, important here is we do not see a tension between that endeavor to keep those people safe, to prevent terrorism from being supported on our platform, and our business. There is no tension there. People oftentimes assume that there is. But we think that people engage more, they share more with one another when they feel safe. And that's been a commitment from the company from the beginning, for at least for as long as I've been there, and long before that. I've been at Facebook about 18 months. And so I think that some of the models that we use when we talk about these issues are a little bit outdated. Those tensions that sometimes we see aren't really there. Now, where does this all go? What does this mean going forward in the future? Just as in society, we are probably not going to eliminate the scourge of terrorism generally. We're not going to be able to get terrorism off the internet completely. But what we can do is drive it back into the corners of the internet. Recreate that system that we saw in 2005, 2006, where instead of this kind of stuff being surfaced in your social media feed, it's off in a corner where you actually have to go looking for it. That's what success looks like. We're working towards it. And at Facebook, we're committed to do our part. Thanks very much.